What would you do if you saw your childhood photo on the wall of a billionaire's mansion, then found out he was the father who declared you dead 20 years ago? Grace Hamilton didn't believe in miracles. At 24, she was used to being invisible, just another face in a black uniform, weaving through marble-floored ballrooms with silver trays of champagne. Her job as a part-time server at elite galas in Chicago barely paid the bills, but it let her glimpse a world that had always been out of reach. That night, she wasn't supposed to be near the private wing of the Lancaster estate, but when a guest asked for directions to the restroom, Grace had taken the wrong hallway. That's when she saw it, a photograph, framed in gold, hanging alone in the middle of the corridor like it was something sacred. She froze. It was her. A picture of her, age 4, wearing a faded pink dress and smiling shyly. Her wild curls, the same hesitant tilt of her head, everything was unmistakably her. "My God! It's me," she whispered, eyes wide. Her hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped the tray she was holding. What was her childhood photo doing inside the private gallery of one of Chicago's most powerful men? She barely had time to stare before a voice snapped her out of the trance. "Hey, staff isn't allowed down here." A security guard appeared, frowning. "Sorry," she stammered, forcing a smile. "I got turned around." She backed away, stealing one last look at the photo before disappearing down the hall. Back in the main ballroom, she couldn't think straight. The music, the clinking glasses, the laughter, it all became background noise. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on a tall man in a tuxedo, Victor Lancaster, philanthropist, tech magnate, widely admired for his charity work with orphaned children. And if her instincts were right, the father she'd never known. He stood at the center of a circle of donors, delivering a speech about the importance of second chances, about what it meant to give love to children without homes. The crowd applauded. Some even wiped away tears. Grace felt sick. She had grown up in the foster system, shuffled from one temporary home to the next, with no explanations and no family. Every file about her early childhood had been labeled "lost in fire." Every question met with half-truths. Now the man who might be her father was standing under a chandelier, accepting applause for his empathy. Her jaw clenched. What kind of man hangs a photo of the daughter he abandoned, like a trophy? Victor spoke again. "I believe no child is truly lost. I know this because I lost my daughter." Grace's heart stopped. The room held its breath. Victor's voice was smooth, controlled, practiced. "She was 4 when we lost her. A tragic accident. It changed me forever, liar." Grace's thoughts burned like fire. "You didn't lose me? You erased me?" In that moment, something inside her shifted. The quiet girl who had always accepted what life handed her disappeared. And in her place stood a woman ready to uncover every lie. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She stayed and watched. She memorized every word he spoke, every name he thanked, every subtle nod to his foundation. If she was going to confront Victor Lancaster, she needed more than suspicion. She needed proof. 3 days later, she couldn't stop thinking about the photo. She barely slept, barely ate. The same questions circled her mind like vultures. Why was he raising money for orphaned kids when he had abandoned his own daughter? Why keep her photo? And what really happened to her mother? Her mother, the missing piece of her life. That's when she remembered someone, Elijah Monroe. He was a long-time bartender for the city's wealthiest events. He had worked at Lancaster's fundraisers for years. If anyone had stories, secrets, rumors, it would be him. She found Elijah cleaning glasses at a small downtown bar later that week. "Hey," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something about Victor Lancaster." He looked up sharply. "Why do you care about that snake?" he said, voice low. Grace hesitated, then took a breath. Because I think he might be my father. Elijah blinked, then laughed. You're not joking, are you? No. I found a photo of me in his house. He exhaled and leaned in. There's been talk for years about a wife who died too young, a daughter who disappeared, but no one ever asked questions when a man like Lancaster signs the checks. Grace sat still, heart pounding. I heard, Elijah said. His first wife, Rose, she was some kind of activist. Always poking her nose into broken systems, foster care, shady adoptions, and just when she was digging too deep, she died? Grace finished. Car accident? Suspicious. And then, boom. Victor becomes a hero, builds his fortune, starts a charity. People forget. Grace felt like she was underwater. Everything made sense, and nothing did. She stood slowly, hands shaking. Thank you, she said. You just confirmed something I've needed to know my entire life. As she walked into the cool night, she didn't feel lost anymore. She felt powerful. She didn't have all the answers, not yet. But she knew where to look. Grace Hamilton wasn't just chasing a name now. She was chasing the truth. And the truth, as she would soon learn, had claws. The night after her conversation with Elijah Monroe, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat at the tiny kitchen table in her studio apartment, surrounded by half-finished cups of tea and crumpled napkins covered in frantic notes. One name kept resurfacing, Rose Hamilton, her mother. The name was faint in official records. Just a few outdated news clippings. But one headline stopped her cold. Children's rights advocate dies in tragic crash weeks after accusing private agencies of corruption. It wasn't just a coincidence. Grace could feel it in her bones. The article included a blurred photo of a woman with tired eyes and curly hair. Grace touched the screen gently. I know you, she whispered. I just never got the chance. If her mother had died trying to uncover illegal adoption practices, and Victor Lancaster was involved, then her entire life had been stolen, not just hidden. But where would she begin? Victor had power, money, and a carefully curated image. She needed someone who could dig deeper than Google. That's when she remembered Martha Reed. Martha was a retired private investigator who frequented the diner where Grace worked mornings. A no-nonsense woman in her 60s, she had sharp eyes, a sharper tongue, and always ordered her coffee black with 2 sugars. Grace caught her that Thursday just before 8 a.m., right on schedule. Ms. Reed, she said nervously, pouring her usual. Uh-oh, Martha said, raising an eyebrow. You never use my last name unless it's serious. Grace set the mug down. I need your help, and I can't pay you. But I'll do anything. Martha studied her, slowly, carefully, like a bloodhound deciding if a scent was worth following. Talk, she said at last. And Grace did. Every word, every memory, every gut feeling. By the end, Martha's face had changed. Sweetheart, she said quietly, you're not looking for your father. You're chasing a man who may have killed your mother. The words hung between them like smoke. Over the next few days, Martha made calls, checked records, and pulled favors from old contacts. She met Grace each night in the back booth of the diner, sliding across manila folders that sent shivers down her spine. One night, she brought something that made Grace's blood freeze. A death certificate, issued for Grace Hamilton, dated the same day Rose died. But I'm alive, Grace whispered, staring at it. Exactly, Martha replied. Victor forged it. Declared you dead. Grace's throat tightened. Why? Because, Martha said, flipping the next page, he collected life insurance payouts for both of you. $500,000. Grace thought she might be sick. He didn't just walk away from you, Martha continued. He erased you, turned your disappearance into a financial gain. Tears blurred Grace's vision. But she blinked them away. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now. Martha leaned in. There's more. Your mother didn't die instantly in that crash. She made it to the hospital, fully conscious, and the nurse who admitted her said she kept whispering the same thing before she passed. Grace held her breath. Protect my daughter from the monster. Silence. Then Grace exhaled slowly, the sound brittle and broken. She died protecting me, while he built an empire off our graves. Martha slid over a final file. Every lie he told, every fake charity dollar he collected, every speech about orphaned kids, built on this. If you want to expose him, Grace, we need to go public. But once we do, there's no turning back. Grace looked at the stack of papers, her fake death certificate, her mother's autopsy. Life insurance claims, photos, reports, receipts. She reached for them with steady hands. He erased me once, she said. This time I'm erasing him. That night, Grace didn't cry. She didn't scream. She planned. It began with small steps. She started creating timelines, printing old photos, combing archives. Her laptop became a war room. She sent anonymous tips to investigative journalists, dropped breadcrumbs on social media, and contacted lawyers who specialized in corporate fraud. But the biggest step came when she made one final decision. She would confront Victor Lancaster in public. Not at his home, not behind closed doors, but on the biggest stage of all, the annual Lancaster Foundation Gala, hosted to raise money for abandoned children. The irony made her want to laugh. She wasn't just going to show up, she was going to make sure everyone saw what he had tried to bury. But first, she needed to get in. And for that, she needed a dress. The invitation was silk, literally, cream-colored cardstock wrapped in a sleeve of satin, embossed with gold lettering. Lancaster Foundation, annual gala, a night for forgotten children. The hypocrisy was so thick, Grace could have choked on it. But Martha Reed got her in. Through an old favor owed by a retired event coordinator, Grace was added last minute to the catering roster. She would wear a crisp uniform, carry champagne flutes, and walk straight into the lion's den. I'm proud of you, Martha said that afternoon, handing Grace a discreet earpiece. But remember, you'll be stepping into a room full of people who've built careers on lies. Stay calm. Don't strike until it matters. Grace nodded, her hands trembling as she adjusted her hair into a sleek bun. He won't see me coming. That evening, the Lancaster estate was lit up like a palace. Valets in white gloves greeted luxury cars. Journalists in velvet ropes filmed every guest arrival. Inside, crystal chandeliers sparkled, and string quartets played classical renditions of pop songs. Waitstaff buzzed like honeybees in the background. Grace walked in through the service entrance, just another uniform. But her eyes scanned the room like a soldier on enemy ground. Then she saw him. Victor Lancaster. The man whose DNA pulsed through her veins. The man who had left her for dead. He stood at the head of a crowd, flanked by TV reporters and wealthy donors. A champagne flute in hand, a polished speech in his pocket, a wolf in philanthropist's clothing. Grace watched him smile and shake hands. She recognized the rehearsed charm. She'd seen it on screens, heard it in radio interviews. Now it sickened her in person. She moved through the crowd, tray in hand. Waiting. Victor stepped up to the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we come together for the voiceless, the abandoned, the forgotten. Grace's breath caught. How dare he? I know their pain because... He paused, voice cracking on cue. I once lost a daughter myself. Murmurs of sympathy rippled through the ballroom. Grace set down her tray. She walked toward the stage, eyes steady, pace even. And though that loss left a hole in my heart, I turned grief into action. She climbed the first step. Victor saw her, blinked, didn't recognize her. She stepped up beside him, took the mic from the assistant, turned to face the crowd. "Mr. Lancaster," she said clearly. "May I ask you a question?" The room fell silent. Victor froze. "Excuse me, miss. Shouldn't you be serving drinks?" She smiled. "I was. But your speech moved me, especially the part about losing a daughter." She turned to the audience. "Can he tell us more about that?" Victor stammered. "It's a personal tragedy." Grace leaned into the mic. "Then I'll help you." "She didn't die in an accident. You abandoned her, after murdering her mother to steal her inheritance." Gasps erupted. Cameras turned. Victor paled. "She's here tonight," Grace continued. "She's me, Grace Rose Hamilton, your daughter. The one you forged death certificates for, the one you thought was gone." Victor's glass dropped to the floor. Journalists scrambled. Grace pulled out a thick envelope. "Here are the fake documents, the forged signatures. The life insurance claims you cashed in on a daughter you claimed was dead." She lifted a photo. "This hung in your private hallway. Me. Age 4, wearing the same pink dress my mother put me in before she died." The screen behind her lit up with the image, "Thanks to Martha," broadcasting from a remote laptop. "To the most amazing dad in the world," read the inscription on the back. Silence, then whispers, then shouting. Victor lunged for the mic. "She's lying." Grace stepped back. "I emailed every reporter in this room 10 minutes ago. They have the receipts, the audio of you confessing to your lawyer, and a copy of the autopsy report showing my mother didn't die on impact. She was poisoned and conscious for hours before she passed." Victor staggered. The room turned. Cameras flashed. And outside, sirens wailed. Grace stepped off the stage as FBI agents entered the ballroom. Victor Lancaster stood frozen, surrounded, his empire crashing with every second. As they cuffed his wrists, he looked at Grace. "You planned all this," she nodded. 20 years, Dad." That's a long time to think. The headlines the next day weren't just local, they were everywhere. Philanthropist exposed by dead daughter in live gala meltdown. Victor Lancaster arrested, the truth behind his empire. Grace Hamilton, the daughter who came back from the dead. But Grace wasn't reading the news. She was standing in front of the Lancaster Foundation headquarters. The same building that once bore her father's name in gold. Now it was hers. A new plaque gleamed by the front door. The Rose Hamilton Foundation for Children's Rights. Named not for Grace, but for her mother. Inside, Martha Reed stood by the reception, flipping through a binder. They already sent over 20 proposals for interviews, and that's just this morning. Grace smiled faintly. "Tell them I'm not ready to talk." Not yet. Her voice was calm, but her mind was a hurricane. She hadn't slept much. Even with Victor in custody, even with the public now seeing the truth, Grace didn't feel victorious. Because justice wasn't a finish line. It was a beginning. There were documents to sort, financial trails to uncover, lies to unravel. And then there were the ghosts. Not just of Rose, her mother, but of herself. The 4-year-old girl who was told no one wanted her. The teenage foster kid who'd cried quietly under thin blankets. The young woman who served drinks to the very people who once erased her existence. Grace walked the halls of the building her father had built, now reclaimed in truth. She touched the walls, the polished wood, the cold marble. She imagined how many donors had walked these halls believing they were doing good, and how much evil had been funded in the name of charity. She didn't want this legacy, but she needed to rewrite it. That night, she and Martha stayed late, going through files, bank statements, photos of children who had never received the money they were promised. "Only 12% of donations ever reached the kids," Martha whispered, shaking her head. "Then we'll fix that," Grace replied. And they did. Over the next few weeks, the entire structure of the foundation was dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up. Gone were the fake outreach programs. Gone were the elite galas, the absurd salaries, the private jets labeled as humanitarian outreach. In their place, 5 real orphanages under construction across the state. A legal team dedicated to reuniting families lost in the foster system. Educational scholarships. Therapy programs. Adoption reform initiatives. Every cent was accounted for. Grace didn't just want to do the right thing. She wanted to do the thing her mother died for. One afternoon, while clearing out an old office upstairs, she found a box marked Helena, Private. Inside were yellowing documents, handwritten notes, letters never mailed. There were transcripts from interviews Rose had done, drafts of articles about corruption in the adoption system, and at the very bottom, a small journal. Grace opened the first page. If anything happens to me, I want Grace to know this. She was loved. She was my light. And I would have done anything to protect her. Tears spilled silently down Grace's cheeks. She clutched the journal to her chest like a lifeline. All these years, she had believed no one cared. But Rose had fought, investigated, died trying to protect her. And now, Grace was finishing what her mother started. That weekend, she traveled to the cemetery. A new headstone had been placed. Rose Hamilton, mother. Activist, hero. Grace knelt beside it. They're gone now, Mum, she whispered. The lies, the cruelty, everything he built on your name, it's gone. She laid a bouquet of white lilies on the grave. I'm going to rebuild it in your name, and this time, it'll be real. As she stood, the wind stirred warm, soft, like an answer. Later that evening, Grace sat with Martha on the rooftop terrace of the building, watching the city lights flicker on. You know, Martha said, sipping tea, you're doing something extraordinary. Grace shook her head gently. I'm just undoing damage. No, you're creating something. A space where truth lives. That's rare. A long silence stretched between them. Grace finally said, Do you think it'll ever feel like enough? Martha gave a small smile. It already is. The silence of the office was a comfort Grace had come to cherish. It was late again, and the city outside her window buzzed with a life she had never known before. Somewhere beneath those lights were children who still waited for answers, families still splintered by the same systems that once swallowed her. But tonight wasn't about pain. Tonight was about the unexpected blessings that followed truth. On her desk sat a tall stack of envelopes. Letters from children, from parents, from strangers who had seen her story unfold and felt something shift in themselves. She opened the first. Dear Miss Grace, I was in foster care too. I used to think people like you only existed in movies. But now I know better. Thank you for fighting for kids like me. The second read, You don't know me, but my sister and I were reunited thanks to your foundation. 8 years apart, now we have a home. You gave us that. Grace blinked back tears. She had spent so much of her life wondering if her voice mattered. Now, it echoed in the hearts of hundreds. Martha Reed. Martha, now officially her assistant, entered with a fresh cup of coffee. Another night with the letters? She asked gently. I can't stop reading them, Grace said, her voice soft. It's like each one heals something in me. Martha sat across from her, setting down the cup. That's because they're not just letters, they're reminders. You gave meaning to your pain. Grace leaned back in her chair. I never planned any of this. I only wanted the truth. And in chasing it, Martha said, you gave others permission to do the same. Just then, her phone vibrated. A call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered cautiously. This is Grace. Ms. Hamilton. The voice was gentle. My name is Pastor Elijah Bennett. I run a small children's shelter outside Milwaukee. I just wanted to thank you. Grace furrowed her brow. For what, Pastor? We received a grant from your foundation last week. We never expected it. We're a tiny place, no website, no public campaigns. But one of your staff said you'd personally chosen us. She smiled. I remember. I read about a boy named Isaiah, who writes poetry in your shelter. Reminded me of someone I used to know. There was a pause on the line. Then, Isaiah wants to talk to you if you don't mind. A new voice came through, small, hopeful. Hi, Miss Grace. I write poems. This one's called Found. It's about when someone finally sees you. Her eyes welled up as the boy recited each line with trembling conviction. When he finished, she whispered, Thank you, Isaiah. That was beautiful. He asked, Will I ever get to meet you? She looked out the window at the city again. I promise you will. After the call, Grace turned to Martha. I want to go see them. All of them. The kids, the homes, the families. Not just write checks. Martha chuckled. I had a feeling you'd say that. The next month, Grace began traveling quietly across the state. No cameras. No press. Just her, a notebook, and the desire to see the change up close. She visited a newly opened home where 5 siblings had been reunited. She ate dinner at a kitchen table surrounded by children who had only known institutional walls. She danced in a parking lot with a teenager who had just received a full scholarship. Everywhere she went, someone knew her story and told her their own. At one shelter, a teenage girl handed her a drawing of Grace, standing beside a statue of a woman with angel wings. It's your mom, the girl said. She's watching you. Grace clutched the drawing to her chest. Thank you. I'll keep this forever. Back in Chicago, the media frenzy around Victor Lancaster's downfall had slowed, but the letters never stopped. Every morning more poured in. Some angry, some grateful, all honest. One stood out. It was from a woman named Claire Hamilton. She was Grace's aunt. Rose's younger sister. The letter was shaky, handwritten in soft blue ink. I spent years searching for you after your mother died. They told me you had perished too. I mourned you like a second daughter. But when I saw your face on the news, I knew. Those are my sister's eyes. Grace, I am your family. If you're willing, I'd like to meet. Grace held the paper as if it might vanish. Family, a word she had taught others to believe in, but had never truly said aloud for herself. That weekend, they met. A small diner on the outskirts of the city. Claire walked in with trembling hands and watery eyes. She looked older than her years, but in her face was the warmth of someone who had loved deeply and lost deeply. You're Rose's girl, she said, tears falling freely. You're her. Grace didn't speak. She just stepped forward and hugged her. And in that moment, something inside her clicked into place. The morning news barely made a ripple. But Grace Hamilton noticed it. Buried between updates on the economy and a viral cat video was a line that made her stop mid-coffee. FBI reopens 2003 case involving children's rights activist Rose Hamilton. She stared at the screen. It was happening. Everything she and Martha had dug up, every piece of paper, every whisper, every lie was finally gaining momentum. Across the city, in a quiet office once belonging to the man who nearly erased her, Grace took a deep breath. It's time, she said aloud. Martha looked up from her desk. You sure you want to go public? Grace nodded. Not just for me. For her. For every child she tried to protect. A week later, Grace sat across from Anderson Cooper on national television. The lights were hot, the studio quiet, the camera red. Grace, Anderson began, millions know your story now, but many are asking, why dig up the past? Why not move on and focus on the future? She didn't flinch. Because I can't heal the future if I ignore the truth. He leaned in. You believe your mother's death wasn't an accident? I don't believe, Grace said evenly. I know. She reached into her bag and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside were 2 documents, her mother's autopsy report and the forged death certificate Victor Lancaster had used to claim she had died at the scene. My mother was alive for nearly 2 hours after the crash, conscious, coherent, and her final words, spoken to a nurse, were, "Protect Grace from him." Anderson blinked. Him? Being? Victor Lancaster? My biological father, the man who profited from declaring me dead. A silence fell over the studio, not scripted. Not staged, just raw weight. Grace continued. He didn't just fake my death. He turned our tragedy into a golden brand. He was the grieving husband, the broken father. He built an empire of pity, while I grew up in foster care wondering why I wasn't wanted. The interview aired in full. Within 48 hours, hashtags like "Hand Justice for Rose," "Hamilton Truth," and "Hack Grace" Unburied trended nationwide. Talk shows debated, newspapers published exposés, former associates of Victor came forward. Some with receipts, others with confessions, but none of it compared to what Grace released next. She had saved it for the right moment, a secret recording from 20 years ago, from a law firm's audio archive, buried in a mislabeled box, preserved on a dusty cassette. In the recording, Victor's voice was unmistakable. Rose is going to ruin everything. She won't stop digging. But if she disappears with the kid, I lose it all. I need this taken care of. The internet erupted. Overnight, public opinion flipped from curiosity to outrage. The Justice Department issued a formal statement. The FBI announced a full-scale investigation into Rose Hamilton's death and the forged documents surrounding Grace's disappearance. And through it all, Grace stayed calm. I don't want revenge, she said in an interview. I want truth, and I want my mother's name cleared. That week, Grace returned to the small cemetery where Rose had been buried under a name stripped of her legacy. No press, no camera crews, just Grace, a bouquet of wildflowers, and a new marble headstone. Rose Hamilton, activist, mother, silenced but never forgotten. Martha stood beside her. She'd be proud. I hope so, Grace whispered, because I'm just getting started. Back at the foundation, the work accelerated. The funds once hoarded in Victor's offshore accounts were now redirected, legally frozen, and through court order reassigned to help reform the very systems Rose had once fought against. Children were reunited with families. Adoption agencies once protected by silence were shut down. And Grace? She began writing. Not a memoir. Not yet, but a report, a full investigative dossier on how wealthy, powerful people exploit tragedy for image and profit, using her own life as the centerpiece. Publishers lined up. She chose a non-profit press. It's not about bestseller lists, she told Martha. It's about giving my mother a voice again. But not everyone celebrated her rise. One evening, as she left a community center event, a man in a black suit approached her outside. Miss Hamilton, he said politely. There are people who would prefer the past stay buried. She didn't blink. Tell them I'm not going anywhere. He handed her a business card with no name, just a number. If you ever change your mind. She tore it in half. Tell them I already did 20 years ago. Later that night, she sat on her balcony, watching the city lights flicker like fireflies. She thought of the girl she had been. The waitress no one noticed, the daughter no one claimed, and she thought of Rose. I hope you're watching, Mom, she whispered into the wind, because they tried to erase us, and now the world knows our names. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers and soft jazz. Everyone who mattered in Chicago's high society was there: bankers, politicians, celebrities, each dressed to impress, swirling champagne and posing for cameras beneath a banner that read, Lancaster Foundation Annual Gala for Orphaned Futures. Victor Lancaster stood at the center of it all. Handsome in a bespoke tuxedo, silver hair styled to perfection, he oozed authority as he greeted donors and smiled for photographs. His voice, smooth and rehearsed, charmed the wealthy, the powerful, the naive. He told them how pain had shaped him, how losing his wife and daughter gave him a mission, how this foundation saved children because he couldn't save his own. But Grace Hamilton, standing in the back dressed as a server, knew the truth, and tonight, so would everyone else. Her heart pounded as she circled the room with a tray of drinks, her eyes locked on Victor. The same man who had signed her death certificate, built his fortune on her mother's blood, and pretended to mourn her. He had no idea she was alive. No idea she had been planning this night for months. At 9 o'clock sharp, Victor stepped onto the stage. The orchestra quieted, lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, voice rich with false humility, thank you for supporting the Lancaster Foundation. As many of you know, I started this mission after suffering a terrible loss, my wife and daughter, taken too soon. Grace gritted her teeth. She moved forward slowly, weaving through the crowd. And while no amount of good can erase grief, Victor continued, I've dedicated my life to turning pain into purpose. The crowd clapped. He smiled. That's when Grace stepped up beside the stage. Excuse me, Mr. Lancaster, she said calmly. The microphone slipped from the assistant's hand. Gasps echoed through the room. Victor looked down at her, confused. This area is for staff. I won't take long, Grace said, climbing the steps. I just have a few questions. As the daughter of orphans, your speech moved me. Victor forced a smile. Of course, but we can discuss it after. Grace took the mic. Actually, I think now's the perfect time. She turned to the crowd. You see, Mr. Lancaster has spent years telling a very moving story about loss, about grief, about transformation. But there's something he never told you. She held up a photo of her 4-year-old self, framed in gold. This picture hangs in his private hallway. She flipped it over. On the back, in faded ink, to the best daddy in the world. Love, Grace. The room went still. Victor's face paled. That little girl, Grace said. She didn't die. She didn't disappear. She was declared dead, so this man could collect insurance money and silence the only two people who knew his secrets, his wife and his daughter. No, Victor muttered. This is slander. Grace turned to him. My name is Grace Hamilton. Daughter of Rose Hamilton. Survivor of your lies. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. Here are the forged death certificates. The life insurance claims. The hospital report that says my mother was alive for 2 hours after the crash and that her last words were about protecting me. She faced the audience again. He built this foundation on a murder. On 2. Cameras flashed, phones recorded. A ripple of whispers surged through the room. And here, she said, her voice unwavering, is the recording where Victor Lancaster discusses taking care of his wife and daughter. The audio played. Victor's voice, unmistakable, cold and calculating. Rose is going to ruin everything. She won't stop digging. But if she disappears with the kid, I lose it all. I need this. Taken care of. Silence. Then outrage. Reporters surged forward. Donors whispered. A senator dropped her wine glass. Victor tried to grab the microphone. This is a setup. She's lying. She's not my daughter. Grace stepped back, keeping her distance. Then why is my childhood photo hanging in your house? Why does the handwriting on my fake death certificate match your assistant's? Victor turned to the crowd. She's manipulating all of you. No, a voice said from the side of the room. It was Martha Reed, walking forward with a USB drive in her hand. The FBI already has everything. Sirens echoed outside. Blue lights flickered through the ballroom windows. Victor staggered. You planned this, Grace nodded. For 20 years, just like you planned how to bury us. The doors burst open. Federal agents entered. Victor Lancaster was handcuffed on the stage he once ruled. As they read him his rights, he locked eyes with Grace. For the first time, he looked small. Broken, beaten, she didn't look away. Not for a second. As they led him out, applause began to rise, not for Victor, for Grace, for Rose, for truth. That night, social media exploded. News headlines screamed, Victor Lancaster arrested at charity gala. Dead daughter returns to expose billionaire father. Justice after 20 years, the Hamilton revelation. But Grace didn't read them. She sat on a bench outside, looking up at the sky. Mom, she whispered, we did it. The news spread like wildfire. By morning, every major network in America had picked up the story. Victor Lancaster, billionaire philanthropist, arrested for insurance fraud, murder conspiracy, and falsifying death records. But for Grace Hamilton, it wasn't about headlines, it was about peace. She stood at the gates of the Lancaster estate no longer as a server, but as the rightful heir to everything Victor had tried to erase. With federal investigators now combing through the mansion's secrets, the estate had been locked down. The grand halls, once filled with deceit, now echoed with silence. Empty, yet not forgotten. What the public didn't know was that the Justice Department had frozen all of Victor's assets. Every dollar he'd stolen, every lie he'd built his empire on, was being dismantled piece by piece. And Grace, thanks to the mountain of evidence she had uncovered with Martha's help, had been granted temporary stewardship over the Lancaster Foundation, a foundation that would finally live up to its name. Instead of limousines and silk galas, the next board meeting was held in a small community center on Chicago's South Side. Grace sat at the head of the folding table, flanked by Martha Reed on her right and Claire Hamilton, her aunt, her mother's sister, on her left. This is where the real work begins, Claire said gently. Grace nodded. It's time we turn his legacy into hers, Rose Hamilton. The woman who died protecting her daughter. The woman who exposed adoption agency corruption and paid for it with her life. Now, nearly 2 decades later, her fight would continue under her daughter's name. The foundation was renamed the Rose Initiative. Within 2 weeks, Grace and her team had redirected the first wave of funding. Instead of black tie galas, the money went into real classrooms, real orphanages, real programs helping foster kids and survivors of abuse. The transformation was swift, and the public rallied behind it. Letters poured in dozens, then hundreds. Kids who had once lived on the streets wrote to say they had roofs again. Single mothers who had been on waiting lists for years received food vouchers. One boy, only 13, wrote, Ms. Grace, I never knew my mom, but hearing about yours makes me want to be someone she would be proud of. Grace read that letter 3 times, each time with tears in her eyes. Meanwhile, Victor Lancaster sat behind bars awaiting trial. The charges were stacking. Investigators had unearthed forged adoption papers, suspicious deaths of whistleblowers, and evidence of millions siphoned from his so-called charitable ventures. His name, once praised in Ivy League halls and Fortune 500 boardrooms, had become synonymous with greed and betrayal. But Grace wasn't focused on revenge anymore. She was too busy rebuilding what Victor had tried to destroy. Each morning she woke up in a modest apartment overlooking the city skyline. It wasn't the penthouse Victor once owned. It was better because it was hers. Her life was no longer built on someone else's lies. She had her name back, her mother's legacy, and something else she thought she had lost forever: family. Claire Hamilton had become more than an aunt. She was the missing puzzle piece, offering stories of Rose's childhood, keeping Grace grounded in their shared bloodline, and helping organize Rose's old journals for future publication. Martha, the retired investigator, had been offered a permanent position as Director of Integrity at the Rose Initiative. She initially laughed at the idea of going back to work, but the truth was, she hadn't felt this alive in years. "I may have grey hair," she said, "but my fire just got reignited." And Elijah Monroe, the bartender who first whispered Victor's name with caution, had joined the outreach team, helping train former foster youth in hospitality jobs. Together, they built a new kind of organization, one rooted in truth, not image, one that didn't hide its scars but wore them as proof that healing was possible. One afternoon, Grace visited the gravesite where her mother lay buried. She knelt beside the headstone they had replaced, a pink marble stone etched with the words, "Rose Hamilton, mother, activist, heroine." "I found her," Grace whispered. She placed a single white rose on the grass. "I found Claire. I found the truth. And I found myself." For a moment, the wind seemed to respond warm and soft against her cheek. She stood, stronger than ever. Later that week, at a public press conference, Grace stood behind a podium bearing the new logo of the Rose Initiative. Her voice was calm, steady, clear. "My name is Grace Hamilton. I was declared dead by a man who wanted to erase me from existence. But I'm here. I survived. And now I'm dedicating my life to the children our system forgot, just like it forgot me. But no child deserves to grow up feeling unwanted. We're here to change that." The crowd erupted in applause. That speech would go on to be played in classrooms, non-profit trainings, and even congressional hearings. But to Grace, the greatest victory wasn't in the spotlight. It was in the quiet moments, like when she helped a 6-year-old girl pick out her first backpack, or when she sat with a teen mom in a shelter and simply listened. Because Grace had learned something few ever do. Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes, justice is planting something new where something cruel once grew, and watching it bloom. 6 months had passed since Victor Lancaster was dragged from the stage in handcuffs. 6 months since Grace Hamilton stood in front of a stunned ballroom crowd and reclaimed a life that had been stolen from her. And now, as spring warmed the streets of Chicago, something else was blooming her legacy. The Rose Initiative had grown faster than anyone expected. The money reclaimed from Victor's fraudulent foundation was not sitting in legal limbo or tied up in court. It was building schools. It was funding therapy for abused children. It was placing roofs over the heads of families who had fallen through the cracks of a system her mother had once tried to fix. Grace had kept her promise. She had turned a name once drenched in scandal into a banner of hope, but fame was never part of her plan. The first article came from a small Chicago paper, Waitress, who exposed a billionaire, now a champion for forgotten kids. Then came the national ones, Time, Forbes, even the New York Times. They all wanted interviews, profiles, quotes. They called her the daughter who rose from the ashes, the voice of justice, the woman who rewrote her legacy. Grace didn't let it go to her head. She still took the subway to work, still wore second-hand jeans and packed lunch in reusable containers, but she couldn't avoid the attention entirely. People started recognizing her, at the cafe, at the train station, at the courthouse. "You're Grace Hamilton, right? You saved those kids." No, she thought. "I didn't save them. I just made sure the world saw them." In truth, Grace felt like her mother was the one still guiding her. Every policy change she pushed, every program she approved, every child she held close after a nightmare. It all felt like continuing what Rose Hamilton started long ago, before corruption silenced her. And Grace made sure her mother was never silenced again. One day, while visiting a youth center built in Rose's name, a girl, no older than 12, hugged Grace and said, "I want to be like you when I grow up." Grace knelt down. "No," she said gently. "You're going to be better." Back at the foundation's headquarters, Martha Reed shuffled into Grace's office with a pile of letters. "You got more fan mail?" Grace laughed. "I get more mail now than Santa Claus." "These aren't fan letters," Martha said. "These are kids." Grace scanned the envelopes, a boy in Detroit thanking her for helping his family find housing. A girl in New Mexico who wrote she no longer felt ashamed of being adopted. A teacher in Baltimore who had started using Rose Hamilton's story as part of her 6th grade curriculum. Grace wiped her eyes. "It's working." Martha leaned on the edge of her desk. "You've become what Victor pretended to be for decades, and you did it in 6 months." "It's not just me," Grace said. "It's the team. It's my aunt. It's the truth." Outside the office, reporters still camped out from time to time, but Grace stopped doing live interviews. She let her actions speak louder than her sound bites. Victor Lancaster, meanwhile, was awaiting trial in a maximum security facility. His lawyers filed motion after motion to reduce charges, dismiss evidence, claim mental strain. But it was all falling apart. Too many witnesses, too many documents, too much truth. And the public had made up its mind. Victor was no longer a visionary. He was a villain. What stung the most, perhaps, was that no one came to visit him. Not his ex-wives, not former colleagues, not even the charities he once paraded around with. The only photo allowed in his cell was the one Jasmine had revealed at the gala, one that proved he had lied about everything. That was his final punishment. To stare every day at the face of the child he tried to erase. But Grace wasn't thinking about him anymore. She had bigger things to do. She had recently launched a new program, Roots and Wings, aimed at helping young people who had aged out of foster care find stable jobs, housing, and mentorship. The first cohort had already graduated. One of them was hired to manage the front desk at the foundation. Another was starting culinary school. And then there was Elijah. The old bartender who had first given Grace a lead on her past had become something of a mentor to the young boys in the program. His quick wit and tough love attitude made him a favorite. He told them stories, taught them how to mix non-alcoholic drinks, listened without judgment. "They don't need a therapist," he often said. "They need someone who remembers their name." One night, at a private event hosted for foster families, Grace took the stage. No press, no cameras, just community. "I used to think that justice meant watching someone who wronged you fall," she told the room. "But real justice is building something stronger where something broken once stood." She paused. "My mother taught me that with her life, and now I'm teaching it with mine." The crowd gave a standing ovation. Not because she was famous, but because she was real. Later, Claire joined her at the edge of the garden, under twinkling lights. "She would be proud, Grace." Grace nodded. "I feel her every day." And she did. In the way the kids laughed, in the way the buildings rose, in the way truth had finally taken root in a world so often built on lies. She wasn't done. Not even close. There were still more orphanages to build, more policies to change, more children to love. But for the first time, Grace didn't feel like she was chasing something. She was leading, and the world was finally ready to follow. The morning was quiet, not the silence of loneliness, but the kind born from peace after a storm. Grace Hamilton stood on the rooftop of the Helena Blackwell Center, her eyes sweeping over the Chicago skyline. Below her, the buzz of life carried on. Children laughing in the courtyard, volunteers organizing supplies, counselors preparing for group sessions. She'd built this. Not just a building, not just a program. A movement, a legacy. And yet, the most remarkable part wasn't what she had created, but who she had become. Not long ago, she had been a waitress in borrowed shoes, serving champagne to the very people who once ignored her existence. Today, she stood as the voice of thousands, proof that your beginning doesn't define your ending. Later that day, a plaque was to be unveiled in her honor, She had insisted it bear not just her name, but her mother's. Helena Blackwell, Grace Hamilton. 2 women, 2 generations, 1 mission. Claire Hamilton, her aunt, met her in the lobby. "Are you ready?" "I was born ready," Grace smiled, her voice steady. The ceremony was modest, just like Grace had requested. No red carpets, no celebrity guests, just the children, the staff, the people who mattered. A small podium had been set up near the garden, where roses bloomed in every shade for sacrifice, pink for grace, white for justice. Martha Reed, now retired from detective work and serving as director of operations for the foundation, took the mic first. "If truth had a face," Martha began, "it would look like Grace Hamilton. And if justice had hands, they'd be calloused from doing the hard work that most people run from." Applause rippled through the crowd. "But most of all," Martha continued, "if love had a legacy, it would be written in the lives of every child this foundation has touched." Then came Claire, tears shining in her eyes. "I lost my sister to a man who thought money could silence a heart," she said. "But I found a daughter I never knew I needed, stronger, wiser, and more courageous than I could have imagined." Finally, Grace stepped forward. No cue cards, no speech, just truth. "I was raised by silence," she began. "By the questions no one answered, by the photo of a little girl lost in the folds of history. But silence didn't win. It never does. Because the truth is louder, braver, and more permanent." She looked out at the crowd, dozens of children whose lives now had meaning, direction, and protection. "I used to want revenge," she admitted. "I wanted Victor Lancaster to feel what I felt, abandoned, erased, voiceless. But today, I want something different. I want to raise voices, not crush them. I want to heal, not just expose. I want to be my mother's daughter, not just in name, but in purpose." A boy in the front row clapped first, then another. Soon, the entire garden was thundering with applause, not for what she said, but for what she meant. After the ceremony, Grace walked through the garden with Elijah Monroe, the former bartender turned youth mentor. He chuckled softly. "You know, you've come a long way from spilling drinks on silk gowns." "I still spill things," Grace laughed. "Now I just have the staff to clean it up." Elijah grew quiet. "You think Victor ever thinks about you?" Grace paused. "Every day, and I hope it hurts." They didn't say anything more. But the air between them held an unspoken truth. Not all wounds heal, but some become the fire that lights others' paths. That evening, Grace sat alone in her office, staring at the last unopened letter from Victor Lancaster. It had arrived 3 weeks earlier, forwarded from the prison. She hadn't intended to read it, but something about the finality of the day made her curious. She opened it. There were only a few lines. "Grace, I see you now, not as the child I abandoned, but as the woman I could never become. I hope one day you can forgive me, but if not, then at least know that you beat me fairly." Victor. Grace folded the letter and placed it in her drawer, not to hold on to him, but to remind herself that even monsters could recognize the light they failed to extinguish. At midnight, she returned to the rooftop. The stars blinked overhead. A soft breeze whispered through her hair. She spoke aloud, not to the sky, but to her mother. "We did it, Mom. We didn't just survive, we transformed." And somewhere deep in her bones, in the marrow of her soul, she felt the answer. Warm, wordless, eternal. Epilogue. The Helena Blackwell Foundation became the most trusted child advocacy network in the Midwest. Over 3,200 children were placed in safe homes. Over 1,000 teens graduated through the Roots and Wings program. And Grace, she never stopped. She wrote a book not about revenge, but about rebirth. It became a New York Times bestseller. And every Sunday, she held story circles where she read to foster children stories about courage, hope, and truth. Not fairy tales, real stories. Like hers, because some of the greatest stories aren't found in books. They are lived, fought for, and passed on, from one survivor to another. The story of Grace Hamilton reminds us that truth, once revealed, can heal the deepest wounds and restore dignity that was once denied. For older audiences, the most powerful lesson is this: it's never too late to reclaim your identity, fight for justice, or start over with a heart full of purpose. Grace refused to let her past define her. She turned pain betrayal from her father, the loss of her mother, and a stolen childhood into a legacy that now supports hundreds of orphans. In a world where many feel forgotten or buried by injustice, her journey shows that resilience, compassion, and the courage to stand for what's right are ageless strengths. No matter your age, if you still believe in doing the right thing, if your heart still beats for truth and love, then you are still shaping the future. Grace didn't just survive her storm, she became a lighthouse for others. That is a legacy anyone, at any stage in life, can choose to build.